friends, it's Quinn. Thanks for watching. So today we are going to be making orange butter cookies, which is one of my favorite recipes. I know this is the second baking vlog in a row, but it's my birthday, so I'm doing these in honor of my birthday. I bake every year for my birthday. You know how when you're in elementary school, you always make a treat to bring into school? Well, I've kind of just continued the tradition. And these cookies are my favorite to make and to eat. So in terms of ingredients, you can see everything here. So you have salt and baking powder, eggs. I use vegan butter as the base. And then of course you have sugar, flour, and the most important, orange extract. You can use orange zest instead of orange extract if you have fresh orange on hand. But I'm a bit of a snob when it comes to oranges, having grown up in Florida. I go to school in Vermont and the oranges here just aren't up to par. So I prefer extract. Okay, so let's get cooking. So one of the first things that you have to do before you even go and start prepping your ingredients is preheat your oven to 425. It's important to do this as soon as possible because when your cookie dough is ready, you want to make sure that your oven is ready to take the cookies. So once you've started heating up the oven, the next step is to go ahead and mix together all of your dry ingredients and your butter. So to start, we're going to add in 3/4 of a cup of sugar. And then we're going to do 1/2 teaspoon of salt. And 1/4 teaspoon of baking powder. Okay. Now once I have all the powders in there, I need to add in 1/2 cup of my vegan butter substitute. And you kind of scoop the vegan butter in the same way you would do like a peanut butter. In some ways it's a little more difficult to use margarine to cook than like sticks of butter, real butter, because they come in sticks forms and a little easier to measure. But I just prefer using the vegan butter because I know for sure it won't make me sick. Then you're going to mix all of your dry ingredients together to the best of your ability. And I always find it useful in doing this to really like mash up that butter to try and get the sugar in. And I just want to say all of your dry ingredients, I do mean excluding flour. That's actually one of the characteristics of a butter cookie, is that the basis is butter and sugar, and you'll add your flour in later on. And I normally will say it's not perfect yet, but it's good enough to go ahead and start adding in the eggs and the orange extract, because they'll help the rest of that sugar kind of become part of the dough. So I'm going to go ahead and add in my 1 egg and my orange extract. I like to crack my eggs on the edge of a count, and then I go ahead and just add that in and throw out the eggshell. Then I'll rinse my hands. In terms of how much orange extract to add, the recipe calls for the equivalent of 1 medium orange peel, but the equivalent of orange zest is 1 teaspoon to 1/2 teaspoon of extract. But I don't actually know how many teaspoons are in a whole medium orange in terms of the peel. So I just kind of eye it, and I've made the recipe enough times that I've just gotten used to what works and what doesn't. So I'll just do a couple squirts. I also super love orangey flavored things, so I don't mind if I accidentally add too much. And once that extract is in, you can really smell it, and then you go ahead and start stirring all of that together. Okay, now we're gonna mix the eggs and the extract into our butter sugar mixture. And it's okay if at this point the butter looks a little curdled, because when you add the flour, that's when you really get cookie dough after this. What I do like to look for at this point is I don't want to see lumps of butter once I integrate everything in together. I like to see it pretty smooth and try not to have lumps of butter or lumps of sugar, because flour is going to clump up real easily if you let it. So you want everything to be smooth as possible, so you're not dealing with multiple clumps of ingredients. And again, not perfect, but I try and just not have major clumps. So the recipe calls for 1.5 cups of flour, and I like to add it in smaller increments to make it easier to stir. If you add a lot of powder all at once, it's going to get very hard to stir evenly, and you'll have flour just flying everywhere. So I'm using 1/4 cup measuring, and I'm going to add 1/2 cup at a time, so I'll be adding the flour in 3 batches. And I always know once most of that flour is stirred in, you'll have a little stuck inside of the bowl, but once most of it's in, it's time to add the next amount. Time for my next 1/2 cup. As you can see, it looks much more like dough now. So now it's time to add my final 1/2 cup. And at this point, you'll start to notice that the dough actually is getting a little dry, where it's wanting to break off into little tiny, almost crumbs, as opposed to really integrating. And once I can see that most of the flour is basically part of the dough, I like to go ahead and just use my hands to really mix in those last crumbs and get everything stirred together. I do very thoroughly wash my hands though, so it's not a hygiene thing. I literally wash my hands between every step, just to make sure everything is clean. And then once I have the dough, I can go ahead and start putting it on cookie sheets. So in terms of scooping up the dough, I always like to do it by hand with just a fork, as opposed to trying to use like a scooper or even like a measuring spoon. Typically what you go off of in terms of size is that you want about a spoonful, so about a forkful. And so I'll go ahead and I'll take a forkful of dough, I'll roll it into a ball, and then I just smush it between my palms to get them round. And just keep repeating until I filled up all my cookie trays, or used up all my dough, whichever comes first. And when I'm making my cookies, I always prioritize consistency over appearance. So it doesn't matter if they're not the prettiest circles, as long as they're about the same size. Especially because some of the roughness around the edges is going to disappear once they start baking and the flour and egg starts expanding. So as you can see, I made 27 cookies, and now I'm just waiting for the oven to heat up to put them in. So my rule of thumb with baking is if I'm not super familiar with both the environment and the oven itself, I'll only put in one tray for my first tray, just because you don't want to risk ruining an entire batch in one go. Because baking is different depending on the humidity and the altitude, and also if you're unfamiliar with an oven. So I'm going to go ahead and put in just one tray of cookies for 6 to 7 minutes, and then I'm going to use what I learned from that. Oh my god, no. I'm going to pretend I didn't do that. We're going to use what I learned from that to inform the rest of the baking. Okay, so one of the things I'll do is go ahead and just check to make sure they're browned a little, which you can tell even without checking the bottom that these are. So we know that this tray is ready to go. So I'm going to go ahead and set them on the counter, let them cool on the tray for a moment before transitioning them into a cooling rack. Now I'm going to go ahead and just scoop them off the tray and onto the cooling sheet. And you just get your spatula in underneath, pop them up, and pop them over to cool. Yeah. And what I like to do is, if they're not coming up, is just try them from a couple different angles. But I always try not to let them break full on in half. So if they're not coming, like, don't fight too hard. Go ahead and work with the cookies to get them free. Because then you at least have a cookie in one piece. And so now the cookies are all done. I did misspeak earlier. I made 28 orange butter cookies. So you're gonna just let them cool on the cooling rack until they're nice and cool. And again, that temperature is gonna vary depending on where you are, and humidity, and a billion different factors. But once they're cool, you can go ahead and serve them up or put them in your Tupperware. Yeah, so they're all good. And one thing to point out with the orange butter cookies is it's okay for them to be very pale. They're not undercooked just because they're white. You can really tell just by the bottom. You want to see a little bit of golden, and that's how you can tell that they're done and ready to eat. So thank you for watching, and I hope you try out this recipe and enjoy it.